She went to a party with hundreds of people around her, music blasting, lights flashing, voices overlapping, and in a place where no one should be able to simply disappear. She vanished without a trace. And to this day, one question still lingers over that night. How does someone walk into a crowded scene and never make it back out? On August 5th, 2022, 16-year-old Kiely Rodni left her home in Truckee, California, heading toward what was supposed to be a normal end-of-summer gathering near Prosser Lake, a place known locally for quiet water, forested surroundings, and occasional parties that drew in teenagers and young adults looking to celebrate before the school year began again. And for Kiely, this wasn't anything unusual. It was just another night out, another chance to be with friends, to enjoy the moment, to exist in a space that felt familiar and safe enough, at least on the surface. She arrived driving her silver Honda CR-V, a detail that would later become one of the most critical pieces in the entire investigation, because that vehicle would eventually raise more questions and answers, but at that moment, it was just transportation, just another car parked among many others scattered around the area, blending into the chaos of a party that quickly grew larger than anyone expected, with estimates later suggesting that hundreds of people had shown up, creating an environment that was loud, unstructured, and difficult to monitor. As the night progressed, the atmosphere shifted in subtle ways that are often only noticed in hindsight, the kind of details that seem insignificant at the time, but later become the focus of intense scrutiny. People moved in and out of groups. Conversations overlapped. Some individuals left early, while others stayed longer than planned. And in the middle of all of this, Kiely was seen interacting normally, speaking with friends, using her phone, and showing no clear signs that anything was wrong, no indication that the night would end any differently than expected. One of the last confirmed interactions came around 12:30 a.m. when she spoke with a friend, a moment that would later be replayed in memory over and over again, examined for any sign of distress, any unusual behavior, any clue that might explain what happened next. But according to those accounts, nothing stood out, nothing that suggested danger, nothing that would have caused immediate concern. And yet, not long after that, something changed. Because after that point, the timeline becomes uncertain. And uncertainty is where cases like this begin to unravel. As the party continued, some people claimed they saw Kiely later into the night. Others weren't sure, and some didn't remember seeing her at all, which created a fragmented timeline that investigators would struggle to piece together. Because when you have hundreds of individuals in a dark, chaotic environment, memory becomes unreliable, details blur, and even the most well-intentioned witness can provide information that conflicts with someone else's account. By the early hours of the morning, the party began to thin out. People started leaving, heading home, getting rides, or simply disappearing into the night in their own way. And somewhere within that window of time, Kiely Rodni vanished. Her phone stopped communicating. Her movements could no longer be tracked. And her car was no longer where it should have been. At first, no one immediately panicked, because in situations like this, it's easy to assume that someone simply left without telling others. Maybe she went home early. Maybe she stayed with a friend. Maybe her phone died. All reasonable explanations that delay the realization that something is actually wrong. But as the morning turned into afternoon, and then into evening, those explanations began to fall apart. Her family couldn't reach her. Her friends hadn't heard from her. And the absence of any communication became impossible to ignore. That's when the situation shifted from confusion to concern, and from concern to urgency. Authorities were notified, and the case quickly escalated due to the circumstances surrounding it. A missing teenager, a large gathering, a last known location that was both specific and chaotic, all factors that made the situation more complex than a typical disappearance, because this wasn't someone who vanished in isolation. This was someone who disappeared in the presence of hundreds of potential witnesses. Investigators began the process of reconstructing the timeline, identifying individuals who had attended the party, collecting statements, reviewing any available footage, and attempting to determine exactly when Kiely was last seen. But the challenge was immediate and significant because the environment itself worked against clarity, low lighting, limited surveillance, and inconsistent accounts created a situation where certainty was difficult to achieve. Search efforts began around Prosser Lake and the surrounding areas, with teams combing through the rain, using drones to scan from above, and deploying search dogs in an attempt to pick up any trace of her scent, because she had left the party on foot or had been taken somewhere nearby. There was a chance that evidence might still be found in the immediate area. But those initial searches did not produce the answers everyone was hoping for. Attention then shifted to her vehicle. Because if Kiely had left the party, she would have needed transportation. And if she didn't leave on her own, then the location of her car could provide critical insight into what happened. An alert was issued for the silver Honda CR-V. Descriptions were shared publicly, and law enforcement began tracking any potential sightings. But as days passed, the vehicle remained missing, and that absence became one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Because unlike a person, a vehicle is difficult to conceal completely. It occupies space, it moves in visible ways, and it typically leaves some kind of trail. Yet in this case, there was nothing, no confirmed sightings, no clear direction, just another layer of mystery. As the investigation expanded, it began to draw national attention, with media coverage increasing and online communities becoming deeply involved in analyzing every available detail, from timelines to witness statements to environmental factors. And while this brought additional visibility to the case, it also introduced a wave of speculation, theories, and conflicting interpretations that made it even more difficult to separate fact from assumption. Some believed that Kiely had left the party with someone voluntarily. Others suggested the possibility of foul play. There were theories about accidents, about hidden locations, about events that may have occurred in the dark where no one was paying attention. Each theory seemed possible in isolation, but none of them could be confirmed. And without confirmation, the case remained suspended in uncertainty. Days turned into a week, then beyond. Search teams continued their efforts, expanding the radius, exploring areas that might not have been initially considered. Because sometimes the key to solving a case lies outside the obvious, in places that are overlooked simply because they don't immediately seem relevant. And investigators knew that in order to find Kiely, they would have to consider every possibility, even the ones that didn't seem likely at first. Throughout all of this, one question remained constant. What happened after 12:30 a.m.? Because somewhere between that moment and the early hours of the morning, something occurred that changed everything. Something that removed Kiely from the environment, that disconnected her from communication, and that left behind no clear, immediate trace. And in cases like this, that gap in time becomes the most important piece of the puzzle. It's where the truth exists, but it's also where the least information is available, which makes it the hardest part to solve. As investigators continued to work, they revisited the party itself, attempting to identify individuals who may have had closer contact with Kiely, people who may have seen something unusual, heard something out of place, or noticed behavior that didn't align with the rest of the environment. Because even in the most chaotic situations, there are moments that stand out, moments that, when placed in the right context, can reveal what actually happened. But identifying those moments requires cooperation and clarity, and both were difficult to achieve. Because not everyone at the party knew each other. Not everyone stayed for the same amount of time. And not everyone remembered the night in the same way, which meant that the answers, if they existed within that crowd, were scattered across hundreds of perspectives. And bringing those perspectives together into a single, coherent narrative was a challenge that would take time. Time that, in missing person cases, is always critical. Because the longer it takes to establish what happened, the more difficult it becomes to trace the sequence of events accurately. The more opportunities there are for details to be lost, and the harder it is to identify the exact moment when everything changed. And yet, Despite all the uncertainty, one thing was clear. Kiely Rodni did not simply vanish without cause. Something happened. Something specific. Something that occurred within a limited window of time and space. And the key to understanding it lay somewhere within that night, within that party, within those final moments that no one could fully account for. And as the search continued, as the investigation expanded, and as the silence around her disappearance grew heavier, the case began to take on a different tone, shifting from immediate urgency to a deeper, more complex mystery, one that required not just effort, but persistence, patience, and a willingness to look beyond the obvious. Because sometimes the truth isn't hidden because it's impossible to find. Sometimes it's hidden because no one has looked in the right place yet. And somewhere out there, beyond the noise of the party, beyond confusion of conflicting accounts, and beyond the limits of what had already been searched, the answer was waiting. The only question was, how far would they have to go to find it? As the days stretched into weeks, the search for Kiely Rodni did not slow down, but the tone began to change, because what started as an urgent effort to find a missing teenager gradually shifted into something heavier, something more uncertain, as investigators and volunteers faced a growing reality that the answers were not going to come easily, and that whatever had happened that night near Prosser Lake was more complex than anyone had initially believed. Search teams continued to comb through the surrounding terrain, moving through dense wooded areas, scanning open ground, and focusing heavily on the lake itself. Because water introduces a different kind of uncertainty, a place where evidence can be hidden, distorted, or completely concealed. And yet, despite repeated efforts, nothing was found in those early stages. No clear sign of Kiely, no confirmed trace of her vehicle, just the same silence that had defined the case from the beginning. That silence began to attract attention far beyond local authorities, drawing in independent search groups and online investigators who believed they could help uncover what had been missed. And among those groups was Adventures with Purpose, a team known for specializing in underwater searches, particularly in cases where vehicles were believed to be submerged, and their involvement would eventually become one of the most critical turning points in the entire investigation. Because while official search efforts had already examined parts of Prosser Lake, the reality is that large bodies of water are difficult to search completely. Visibility is limited, conditions can change, and without precise coordinates, it's possible for something to remain hidden even after multiple attempts to locate it. And that possibility was exactly what this independent team focused on when they arrived in the area. Using specialized sonar equipment, they began scanning sections of the lake that had either not been fully explored or acquired a different approach, moving methodically, mapping the underwater landscape, identifying anomalies, and narrowing down potential targets that could match the shape and size of a vehicle. And it didn't take long before something appeared on their radar. An object, submerged, not far from the shoreline, at a depth that made it easy to miss without the right tools. And in that moment, the case shifted, because for the first time since Kiely disappeared, there was something tangible, something that could be investigated, something that might finally provide answers to the question that had been lingering for weeks. Divers were deployed, carefully, deliberately, because in situations like this, every movement matters, every detail matters. And as they descended into the water, approaching the object detected by sonar, the shape became clearer. It was a vehicle, a silver Honda CR-V, the same make and model Kiely had been driving. And just like that, the mystery that had consumed so many people for weeks took a turn that no one could ignore. The vehicle was confirmed to be hers, submerged in Prosser Lake, relatively close to where the party had taken place, in a location that, in hindsight, seemed almost impossible to overlook. And yet, it had remained hidden. Inside the vehicle, investigators made another discovery. Kiely Rodni was there. The search was over, but the questions were not. Because finding her car at the bottom of the lake did not immediately explain how it got there, or what exactly happened in those final moments after she left the party. And while the discovery provided a form of closure, also introduced a new layer of complexity that would define the rest of the investigation. Authorities began examining the scene in detail, analyzing the position of the vehicle, the condition it was in, and the surrounding environment, try to determine whether this was a result of an accident, an intentional act, or something else entirely, because each possibility carried very different implications, and the evidence would need to support whichever conclusion they ultimately reached. Initial assessments suggested that the vehicle had entered the water from a nearby embankment, an area where it would have been possible for a driver to accidentally veer off course, especially in low visibility conditions at night in an unfamiliar or chaotic environment. And this theory began to shape the direction of the investigation, but it was not immediately accepted by everyone, because for many, the idea that a vehicle could enter the lake so close to a crowded party without anyone noticing seemed difficult to believe, especially given the number of people present, the noise, the movement, and the general awareness of the environment. And this is where the case began to divide public opinion, with some accepting the possibility of an accident, while others questioned whether something more had occurred. Investigators conducted further analysis, including examining data from the vehicle itself, looking at mechanical factors, and reviewing any available digital evidence that could provide insight into the final moments before the car entered the water, because modern vehicles often contain information that can help reconstruct events. And in a case like this, even small details could be critical. At the same time, they continued to revisit witness statements, cross-referencing accounts, looking for inconsistencies, and trying to identify any detail that might support or contradict the emerging theory. But despite these efforts, there remained gaps, moments that could not be fully explained, and questions that did not have clear answers. How did no one see the vehicle enter the water? Was she alone at that moment? Did something happen inside the car that led to a loss of control? Or was there another factor that had not yet been identified? These questions lingered, even as the investigation moved forward. Eventually, official findings began to point toward a tragic conclusion. The determination was that Kiely Rodni's death was a result of an accidental drowning, with no evidence found to support foul play. And from a legal standpoint, that provided an answer, a resolution that allowed the case to be closed in terms of criminal investigation. But for many people following the case, that conclusion did not eliminate the uncertainty, because while it explained what happened in a general sense, it did not fully explain how it happened in detail. And in cases like this, those details matter, they shape the narrative, they influence how the story is understood, and they determine whether people feel that the truth has been fully uncovered. The involvement of independent search teams, the timeline of the discovery, and the circumstances surrounding the vehicle's location all contributed to a broader conversation about how the case was handled, what was missing in initial search efforts, and whether different approaches could have led to earlier answers. And while these discussions do not change the outcome, they do highlight the complexity of investigations that involve large areas, limited information, and environments that can conceal critical evidence. For Kiely's family, the discovery brought an end to the search, but not to the impact of what had happened. Because closure in cases like this is not about solving a mystery. It's about coming to terms with a loss that cannot be reversed. And while the official conclusion provides a framework for understanding the event, it does not remove the emotional weight that comes with it. And for those who follow the case from the beginning, the story remains a powerful reminder of how quickly circumstances can change, how a single night can alter everything, and how even in situations where there are hundreds of people present, it is still possible for something to happen without immediate explanation. Because that is what makes this case so unsettling. Not just the outcome, but the setting, a crowded party, a public place, a moment in time where everything seemed normal. And yet, within that environment, something went wrong. Something that no one clearly saw. Something that left behind questions that may never be fully answered. And even though the investigation reached a conclusion, the story of Kiely Rodni continues to resonate, not just because of what happened, but because of how it happened and the way it challenges assumptions about safety, awareness, and the idea that being surrounded by people automatically means being protected. Because sometimes the most unsettling truths are not the ones that involve clear intent or obvious actions. Sometimes they are the ones that happen quietly, unexpectedly, in places where no one is looking closely enough. And by the time anyone realizes something is wrong, it's already too late. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about how quickly a normal night can turn into something else entirely, then make sure you subscribe to Dark Truth, Unsolved Cases, like this video, and share it with someone else. Because stories like this deserve to be remembered, and the more they are told, the less likely they are to be forgotten